The shovel struck a stone, the sound a dull clank in the crisp autumn air. Elias paused, wiped a sleeve across his brow, and looked at the growing pile of dark earth beside the shallow trench. It was barely 3 feet deep, 12 feet long, and 8 feet wide, a meager scar on the land beside his small, isolated cabin. His dog, Boro, a great shaggy beast of indeterminate lineage, watched from the porch steps. Boro's intelligent eyes followed his every move, his head cocked with a quiet patience that seemed to mirror Elias's own. The dog had been his only companion since his parents had passed the previous winter, leaving him with the cabin, 20 acres of unforgiving land, and a collection of his father's meticulously kept journals. Elias flexed his hands, the skin already raw, and drove the shovel back into the stony soil. He was not digging for a root cellar, not a simple storage pit. He was digging for something more, a voice, rough and weathered as the land itself, cut through the silence. "Trying to reach China, boy?" Elias looked up. Mr. Abernathy stood at the edge of his property, leaning on the worn gray fence that separated their lands. Abernathy was a man made of leather and skepticism, his face a roadmap of hard winters and failed crops. He'd lived on the neighboring plot for 40 years and believed he understood the immutable laws of the land, laws he was certain Elias was breaking. Elias drove the shovel in again before answering. "Building!" Abernathy spat a stream of tobacco juice near his boot. "Building what? A grave? That hole will be filled with snow and ice before the first real storm. Then the spring thaw will turn it into a mud pit and collapse the foundation of your house. I've seen it happen." "I have a plan," Elias said, his voice low, not argumentative. He did not point to the house, to the carefully stacked lumber he'd spent his last $17 on at Gable's General Store. He did not mention his father's journals. "A plan," Abernathy scoffed, shaking his head as he turned to leave. "The ground will freeze solid in a month. That'll be the end of your plan. You're a fool, Elias Thorne. Just a young fool digging a hole for no reason." The words hung in the air, but Elias did not watch him go. He focused on the rhythm of the work. Dig, lift, toss. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadow of the cabin stretched long fingers toward the trench. Boro padded over, nudging a cold, wet nose into his hand during a brief rest. Elias scratched behind the dog's ears, the rough fur a comforting anchor. The community was small, nestled in a valley that acted as a funnel for winter storms. They were hardy people, but their hardiness was rooted in tradition, in doing things the way they had always been done. His father had been different. He had been an engineer in the city before seeking a quieter life, and he saw the world not as a set of immutable rules, but as a series of problems to be solved. That evening, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Elias sat at the small wooden table his father had built. He ran a finger over the brittle page of a journal. The ink was faded, the handwriting precise. It was a schematic, a cross-section of the cabin's foundation. Below it, a larger, reinforced space was drawn in, labeled sub-level shelter. There were notes in the margins, calculations of load-bearing capacity, airflow dynamics, and thermal insulation. "The wind is the killer," his father had written. "Not the cold. A structure can be warm, but if the wind finds a way in, it will steal the heat faster than any fire can make it. The earth is the best insulation. Go down. The earth holds its peace." Another page detailed a ventilation system, a clever design using 2 insulated pipes. One would draw fresh air from a shielded intake near the hearth, where the rising heat of the main fire would help pull it down. The other, an exhaust for the small wood stove planned for the shelter, would vent up through a secondary flue hidden within the main chimney stack. It was a closed loop, a breathing system designed to keep the air fresh without letting the killing wind inside. It was unconventional wisdom, the kind of thinking that made men like Abernathy nervous. The next day, Elias made the 2-mile walk to Gable's general store. It was the valley's hub, a place of commerce and a clearinghouse for local gossip. Mr. Gable, a portly man with a face that was perpetually flushed with either exertion or indignation, watched him approach. "Back again, Thorne?" Gable said, wiping the counter with a stained rag. "Run out of lumber already?" "I need pipe," Elias said, placing a small, hand-drawn list on the counter. 6-inch stovepipe, 40 feet of it, and 2 cast-iron elbows. Gable squinted at the list, then at Elias. 40 feet? What are you doing, running a stovepipe to the moon? You building a still down in that hole? The question was loud enough for the 2 other customers in the store to hear. They chuckled. "Ventilation," Elias said simply. Mrs. Gable emerged from the back room, a woman whose kindness was often at war with her husband's bluster. She placed a hand on his arm. "Now, Henry, the boy knows what he's doing." Her eyes on Elias were soft, but filled with a pity that felt heavier than her husband's scorn. "Are you sure you're eating enough, Elias? You're looking thin." "I'm fine, thank you, ma'am," he said, counting out the coins for the pipe. He bought another box of nails and 3 heavy sacks of cement mix. Henry Gable shook his head as he helped load the materials onto Elias's handcart. "Cement, lumber, pipe. You're spending a fortune to build a tomb, son. When the ground heaves in January, it's going to snap those pipes and crack that foundation right in 2. You wait and see." Elias didn't argue. He just nodded, gripped the handles of the cart, and began the long, slow pull back to his cabin. Boro trotted ahead, occasionally looking back as if to ensure his master was still coming. The weight of the materials was immense, but it was the weight of the town's certainty that felt heavier. They saw a boy digging a hole. He saw a sanctuary taking shape. As he crested the final rise, he saw his cabin, small and solitary against the darkening sky. The first cold wind of the season was blowing from the north, carrying the scent of snow. He had a lot of work to do. The work became his world. The sun rose, he worked. The sun set, he worked until his muscles screamed, and the lantern light cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls of the pit. He was no longer digging a trench. He was excavating a room. The final dimensions were 20 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. He hauled out the dirt 1 bucket at a time, a Sisyphean task that built cords of muscle on his back and arms. His hands, once raw, were now protected by a thick layer of calluses, cracked and permanently stained with earth. Boro would often lie at the edge of the pit, his head on his paws, a silent, furry supervisor. Sometimes, when Elias hoisted a particularly heavy rock to the surface, the dog would let out a low woof of what sounded like encouragement. Weeks bled into one another. The vibrant colors of autumn faded to the muted browns and grays of late fall. The ground grew harder, and the shovel often glanced off the frozen topsoil with a jarring thud. He switched to a pickaxe, the sharp impacts echoing in the hollow silence. Each swing was a testament to his stubbornness. He was racing the winter, a race everyone was certain he would lose. The day he began installing the support beams was the day Mr. Abernathy stopped by again. Elias had the first of the 6 by 6 inch posts wrestled into place. He was using a system of levers and ropes, a technique painstakingly diagrammed in his father's journal, to hoist the heavy overhead beams into position. It was slow, dangerous work for one man. "That'll never hold," Abernathy declared from his usual spot by the fence. He didn't offer to help. The sheer weight of the earth above it, you need a center post, at least 2. "The load is distributed to the side walls," Elias said, not looking up. He was focused on securing a joint. "The beams are set every 4 feet. It's strong enough." 4 feet apart? That's foolishness. It's the frost heave I'm telling you about. It doesn't just press down, boy. It squeezes from the sides. It'll pop those posts like toothpicks. You'll be buried alive in your own hidey hole. Elias finished hammering a wooden peg into a pre-drilled hole, securing the beam. He finally looked over at his neighbor. It will hold. His certainty was so quiet, so devoid of anger or pride, that it seemed to unnerve Abernathy more than any argument would have. The old man just grunted and walked away, muttering about the arrogance of youth. Elias watched him go, then turned back to his work. He had 31 more posts to set. Next came the concrete. He mixed it in a wheelbarrow, one heavy sack at a time, the gray slurry clinging to his clothes and skin. He poured a 4-inch slab for the floor, smoothing it with a piece of lumber. Then he began the painstaking process of lining the earthen walls. He built wooden forms, mixed more concrete, and poured it in sections, creating a solid, reinforced shell. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. The space slowly transformed from a dirt-walled cavern into a clean, dry bunker. It smelled of damp earth, curing concrete, and fresh-cut pine. It was during this phase that he had his second visitor, who wasn't a skeptic. A young woman appeared at the edge of the woods, holding a covered basket. It was Clara, Mr. Abernathy's niece, who had come to help her aging uncle for the season. She was quiet like Elias, with observant eyes that missed nothing. "My uncle said you were busy," she said, her voice softer than the rustling leaves. "My aunt sent some stew. She worries you're not eating." Elias straightened up, wiping his concrete-dusted hands on his pants. He felt a flush of awkwardness. He was covered in grime, his hair matted with sweat. "Thank you." She stepped closer, peering down into the subterranean room. Her eyes weren't mocking. They were curious. She saw the neat stacks of lumber, the carefully laid pipes, the smooth gray walls. She saw order and intention, not madness. "He says you're digging a tomb." "It's a shelter," Elias corrected gently. Her gaze fell on the 2 pipes that emerged from the wall and ran toward the cabin's foundation. "What are those for?" It was the first time anyone had asked a genuine question. "Air," he said, surprised at his own willingness to explain. "One brings fresh air in from near the fireplace. The other takes the smoke from the stove out through the chimney, so the fire can breathe, and so can I." Clara nodded slowly, processing the information. She looked from the pipes to the sturdy ceiling beams, then back to him. "That's clever." She handed him the basket. The stew was still warm. "Be careful, Elias." She didn't say more, but her tone was one of genuine concern, not pity. It was a small thing, a basket of stew and a kind word, but it felt like a greater support than 100 fence-post lectures. He ate the stew sitting on an overturned bucket in his nearly completed shelter. Boro sat at his feet, getting the occasional piece of beef. The space was starting to feel less like a construction site and more like a room. He built shelves into the walls, sturdy and deep. Then he began the process of stocking them. It was a methodical ritual. He brought down the supplies his parents had laid in, adding to them with what little money he had left. 100 cans of beans sorted by date, 50 pounds of salted pork wrapped in cheesecloth, 20 gallons of water in sealed barrels, sacks of flour, sugar, and dried apples, boxes of candles, matches, and kerosene for the lamps. He stacked firewood against one wall, nearly a full cord, dry and seasoned. One afternoon, while he was installing the small cast-iron stove that would heat the space, the saw slipped. It was a stupid, tired mistake. The blade jumped and bit deep into his left forearm. Blood welled instantly, dark and alarming. Boro whined, sensing his distress. Elias clamped his right hand over the wound, his heart pounding. He stumbled up the ladder and into the cabin, grabbing the first aid kit from the mantelpiece. His hands were shaking as he cleaned the gash. It was deep, at least 4 inches long, gaping open. It needed stitches. There was no doctor for 10 miles. He found his mother's sewing kit. He sterilized the smallest needle in the flame of a candle and threaded it with a piece of fishing line, just as he'd seen his father do once for a deep cut on his own leg. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed the needle through his own skin. The pain was sharp, sickening. He made 6 clumsy, uneven stitches, pulling the edges of the wound together. He bandaged it tightly with a clean cloth. The throbbing was immense, but the bleeding had stopped. He sat at the table for a long moment, sweat beading on his forehead, Boro's head resting on his knee. He had to be more careful. Winter was coming, and he was not finished yet. The final piece was the door. He built it himself from 2 layers of thick oak planks, cross-braced and insulated with packed wool. It was set at the bottom of a reinforced stairwell, angled so that snow would not drift directly against it. The door to the stairwell, at the top, was a heavy slanted hatch that lay nearly flush with the ground behind the cabin. It was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. By the first week of December, he was done. The first true snow had fallen, a light 6-inch blanket that covered the land in a pristine white. The pile of excavated earth was a gentle mound under the snow, the hatch a barely perceptible line. From the outside, nothing looked different. Mr. Abernathy saw him splitting firewood and nodded, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Gave up on that fool project, did you? Good. A man belongs above the ground." Elias just nodded. "I'm ready for winter." "We'll see," Abernathy said. "We'll see what the mountain decides to send us this year." The air had a strange stillness to it in the days that followed. The sky was a high, pale gray, the color of old iron. The birds were gone. The squirrels, usually a constant chittering presence, were nowhere to be seen. Boro became restless. He would pace the length of the cabin, his claws clicking on the floorboards, occasionally stopping to whine at the door, his nose pressed to the crack. Elias felt it too, a pressure in the air, a deep, resonant silence that felt like a held breath. His father's journals had a section on weather. "Watch the animals," he'd written. "They know before we do. And watch the smoke from the chimney. When it gets beaten back down instead of rising, a low-pressure system is moving in. The heavier the air above, the harder it is for the smoke to rise. When it lays flat and streams away, the storm will be powerful." The smoke from his chimney was barely clearing the roofline before being whipped away sideways by a non-existent wind. Elias made his final preparations. He brought Boro's bed down into the shelter. He filled the lamps with fresh kerosene. He laid a fire in the small stove, ready to be lit. He checked the seal on the door one last time. The snow began to fall 2 days later. It started gently, fat, lazy flakes drifting down from the iron sky. But there was no wind. It was unnervingly quiet. By midday, 6 inches had accumulated. By dusk, it was over a foot, and the flakes were smaller, harder, driven by a rising wind that moaned around the corners of the cabin. Elias lit the fire in the main hearth, cooked a simple meal of bacon and bread, and shared it with Boro. The wind was getting louder, a low growl that was steadily building to a shriek. He looked out the window. He could no longer see the fence line. The world had dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The cabin groaned as a gust hit it, the windows rattling in their frames. This was no ordinary storm. This was something else entirely. He banked the fire in the hearth, pulled on his heaviest coat, and opened the cabin door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the wall. Snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted into the room. "Come on, Boro," he shouted over the roar. He led the dog out back to the hidden hatch. He had to use all his strength to lift it against the wind. Below, the stairwell was dark and inviting. They scrambled down, and he pulled the heavy hatch closed above them. The sound of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, angry hum. He moved to the inner oak door, swung it open, and stepped inside. The air was still and cool, smelling of earth and wood smoke. He closed the thick door, shot the heavy wooden bolt, and the world went silent. He lit a lantern. The small flame threw a warm, steady glow over the room. It was a space of profound peace in the heart of a raging tempest. He lit the kindling in the small stove. The flue drew perfectly. Within minutes, a gentle warmth began to radiate through the shelter, a stark contrast to the brutal cold he knew was ravaging the world above. Boro curled up on his bed with a contented sigh. Elias sat on a wooden crate, listening. He could feel the faintest vibration through the concrete floor, the shudder of the earth itself under the storm's assault. But down here, he was safe. His father had been right. The earth held its peace. For 3 days the storm raged. Elias and Boro lived in their quiet, subterranean world. They ate, they slept. He read his father's journals by lantern light. The ventilation system worked flawlessly, providing a steady stream of fresh, cool air that fed the stove and kept the shelter from becoming stuffy. The temperature held at a comfortable 60 degrees. Above them, the blizzard was rewriting the landscape. The wind, which weather services would later clock at over 100 miles per hour, scoured the valley. The snow fell at a rate of 3 inches an hour, piling into massive drifts that buried fences, roads, and entire buildings. On the morning of the 3rd day, a new sound penetrated the shelter's quiet. It was a frantic, muffled pounding, not from the hatch above, but from the main cabin. Boro's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. The sound was desperate. He unbolted the door, climbed the stairs, and pushed on the hatch. It wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder into it and heaved. It moved an inch, grinding against something. Snow, a deep, heavy weight of it. He pushed again with all his strength and managed to open it a foot. He squeezed through the gap into a world he didn't recognize. The snow was level with the cabin's roof. He was in a narrow canyon of his own making. The back door of the cabin was a few feet away, somehow still accessible in the lee of the house. The pounding was coming from the front. He waded through the chest-deep powder to the front door and managed to wrench it open. Mr. Abernathy fell inside, his face a mask of frozen snow and terror. His wife and Clara were huddled behind him. "Elias," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The roof, the weight, it's going to collapse. We heard your chimney, saw the smoke." Elias didn't waste words. "This way." He led them through the cabin, out the back, and down into the shelter. They stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Abernathy ran a hand over the smooth concrete wall, his mouth agape. Clara looked at the functioning stove, the neat stacks of supplies, the warm, dry air. It's warm," Mrs. Abernathy whispered, her body shaking from cold and relief. They had barely settled when another desperate cry came from above. Elias climbed back out. It was the Gables, their fine coats in tatters, their faces streaked with tears. Their two-story house, with its grand windows, had become a death trap. The wind had shattered the glass on the first floor, and the house was filling with snow, the temperature inside no different from the outside. "We saw the smoke," Mr. Gable stammered, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a raw, pleading fear. "We thought everyone was dead." By nightfall, 17 people were huddled in his shelter, the entire population of their small, isolated corner of the valley. They were farmers, trappers, and their families, people who had watched him dig all autumn, shaking their heads, people who had called him Mad Elias. Now they sat on his floor, wrapped in his blankets, eating his food, their survival entirely dependent on the hole they had mocked. The irony was a palpable presence in the room, but no one spoke of it. There was only the sound of the wind, a distant, defeated howl, and the quiet, crackling life of the stove. Elias moved among them, handing out bowls of hot bean soup, tending to a frostbitten hand, his movements calm and efficient. He was no longer the strange, solitary boy. He was their anchor in the storm. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the silence was more shocking than the noise had been. A brilliant, painful sunlight streamed through the crack Elias made in the snow-choked hatch. The world outside was a ruin of white. The snow had drifted 20 feet deep in places, burying homes to their eaves. Abernathy's roof had collapsed entirely, crushing the back half of his house. The grand windows of the Gable store were dark, empty eyes in a wall of white, the interior a frozen cavern. Many of the other, smaller cabins were simply gone, visible only as soft mounds in the endless snowscape. The survivors emerged from the shelter like newborns, blinking in the bright, cold light. They stood in the narrow trench Elias had dug to get to his cabin door, a small pocket of safety in a landscape of utter devastation. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They simply stared at what was left of their world. It was Abernathy who broke the silence. He turned to Elias, his weathered face etched with a shame so profound it seemed to have aged him 10 years overnight. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I was wrong." He put a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. "I'm sorry. You saved us. You saved all of us." Henry Gable, a man who had never admitted to being wrong in his life, simply nodded, his eyes wet. He looked at the sturdy, almost invisible hatch, then at the thin plume of smoke still rising from the hidden flue. "I sold you the lumber," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you it was a tomb." He shook his head. "It's an ark." Elias felt the weight of their gazes. He was not used to being the center of attention. He simply gave a short, sharp nod. "There's work to do." And with that, the spell was broken. The shock gave way to the grim reality of survival. The work was immense. They had to dig out their homes, assess the damage, and find what livestock had survived. Elias's cabin became the command center. His shelter, no longer hidden, became the community kitchen and infirmary. His knowledge, once dismissed as eccentricity, became invaluable. He showed Abernathy how to build a snow cave to shelter his 2 surviving cows. He explained the principles of load-bearing to Gable, helping him shore up what was left of his store. He taught them things from his father's journals: how to read the weather, how to build for the wind, how to respect the crushing weight of the snow. He never raised his voice, never said, "I told you so." He just showed them. He worked alongside them, his actions speaking with a clarity his words never could. They had called him a fool for digging a hole. Now they saw that he had been the only one building on solid ground. The years passed. The great blizzard of that winter became a landmark in time, the event by which all others were measured. The valley slowly healed, but it was never the same. It was stronger, wiser. The first project the community undertook together was the expansion and formalization of Elias's shelter. They excavated a larger area, poured more concrete, and built a proper sheltered entrance near the cabin. It was no longer Elias's Crawlspace. It was the valley storm shelter, a place of safety for all, its existence a permanent monument to the storm that had nearly destroyed them. Elias, with Clara now quietly and constantly by his side, oversaw the work, teaching the younger men the techniques his father had passed down to him. He and Clara married in the spring, in a simple ceremony by the creek. Their life was a quiet one, built on shared work and mutual respect. Their home was a place of warmth and welcome, the center of the small, tightly knit community he had inadvertently forged. He never lost his quiet nature, but the isolation melted away. He was still a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He became the repository of the valley's practical wisdom, the one they turned to when the sky looked strange or a foundation needed setting. One autumn afternoon, nearly 15 years after the great storm, Elias sat on the porch, watching the leaves turn. Boro, now old and gray-muzzled, lay at his feet. The dog's breath was shallow, his great, loyal heart finally slowing. He had been a constant, unwavering presence through all of it. The lonely digging, the town's scorn, the fury of the storm, and the long, peaceful years that followed. Elias gently stroked the dog's head, his hand resting on the soft fur behind his ears. Boro looked up at him, his intelligent eyes full of a lifetime of trust. And then, with a soft sigh, he was gone. Elias carried the dog's still body to the top of the small hill that overlooked the cabin and the valley beyond. He dug a grave in the soft earth, placing his old friend to rest. Clara stood beside him, her hand in his. There was no ceremony, just a shared, silent grief. The passing marked a turning point, the quiet closing of a chapter. More years turned. Elias's dark hair turned to gray, then to white. The lines on his face deepened, mapping a life of hard work and quiet contentment. He saw his father's knowledge take root in a new generation, saw them build their homes stronger, smarter. He saw them check the smoke from their chimneys and watch the behavior of the animals. The lessons of the blizzard had been learned, paid for in loss, but resulting in a resilient, enduring wisdom. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, an old man of 82, with Clara's hand holding his. The entire valley mourned him. They buried him on the hill beside Boro, overlooking the home he had built and the community he had saved. They placed a simple stone marker, carved by a stonemason's son, whom Elias had pulled from a snowdrift as a boy. The epitaph was short, just 5 words that captured the essence of his life. He dug deep and saved us all. Long after he was gone, the cabin still stood, and beside it, the heavy, reinforced door to the valley storm shelter remained, a silent promise against the winter wind. It was more than a structure of concrete and wood. It was his legacy, a testament to a quiet, stubborn boy who, armed with his father's knowledge and his own patient hands, had listened to the earth while others listened only to their own doubts. He had proven that sometimes the only way to stand tall against the storm is to first have the wisdom to go down.